hear that sound? That's Jesus calling. He's saying, shut up. Okay, so be listening for Jesus. Some of you have a hard time. Some of you have wow. Some have a hard time. I get that. This is Jesus. Listen for Jesus when he's calling. Okay. Then he'll hand things over to me. So, but he calls you. Good morning. Oh, tardy. They came from the greatest distance. Good morning and welcome. My apologies to those of you who don't have name tags. Those who weren't here last month and we went to lacrosse, I was short on the plastic sleeves, and so I had to mail some off to Michael Lopez Kelly, and I didn't have enough, so I pulled your sheets out of the plastic and I sent them to lacrosse, and then I forgot to refill them. I had them on my desk. I saw them. What are these doing here? I said, I don't know. Maybe second or double duplicates, and then now I realized, I forgot to bring. Anyway, next month you'll be named. So anybody on a name tag is just here for the lunch. They're here for the free lunch. There are books. I think some of you were still short atlases and Erdmann's dictionaries. They're piled up on that table that away. So please, if you are short, take one so that I don't need to haul them back with me. They're heavy. Last time, we began our study by dealing with what we might call the root experience, the central founding event of the Jewish people as recorded in the book of Exodus. But that's not the only place the story is told. And so for prayer today, I would like to use a little bit of one of the Psalms. We won't deal with the Psalms until year 3, but just, there are Psalms for every season. There are happy Psalms and sad Psalms and mad Psalms, but there are also historical Psalms that retell the story. And we're going to do a little bit of Psalm 136. You'll get a sense of, again, in a culture where people weren't literate and written things were costly, congregational participation was usually done by repetition, monkey see, monkey do, or by refrain. This is where the idea of a responsorial psalm or refrain that we use at Mass comes from, because in the early church, again, you didn't have printing books, and so the way to get the congregation involved was to give them a refrain that they would repeat. So your line is, "For his love endures forever." Okay? And I'm going to, so after each phrase I give, if you would repeat, "For his love endures forever." This is Psalm 136. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good.
For his love endures forever.
Oh, give thanks to the God of gods.
For his love endures forever.
Give thanks to the Lord of lords.
For his love endures forever.
To him who alone does great wonders.
For his love endures forever.
To him who smote the firstborn of Egypt.
For his love endures forever.
For his and brought Israel out from among them.
For his love endures forever.
With a strong hand and an outstretched arm.
For his love endures forever.
To him who divided the Red Sea in two.
For his love endures forever.
For his steadfast, and made, I keep cutting out and repeating your part here, sorry. And made Israel pass through the midst of it.
For his love endures forever.
But overthrew Pharaoh and his host in the sea.
For his love endures forever.
To him who led his people through the wilderness.
For his love endures forever.
Oh, give thanks to the God of gods.
For his love endures forever.
Good and gracious God, be with us again as we, this Christian body, understand our roots in the story of Israel of old and of your saving work, which led not just to victory over Pharaoh, but led to the making of a covenant and the establishing of a place where we could meet you. Help us appreciate the gift of pledge making and presence. We ask through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen. I have for you, again, I'm going to pass this around. Many of you have come up and thrown money at me. I'm used to that. Happens a lot to me. Wherever I go, people throw money at me. So what I have, again, is the printout of what my computer has on you. And on the back are, again, the book, cost of the books. Again, if you can pay it, great. If you can't, that's not a, I know where you live. I'll track you down. I have Guido I'll send out the great gifts. Yes. DSBS. Diocesan School of Biblical Studies. If you forget that, make it out to me, and I will just sign it over. You can trust that. Trust me. Trustworthy. You look lovely. How are you? I'm glad both of you came back. That's good. It's a good sign. So, are we ready? Any questions before we plunge ahead? All right. As I said, last class focused on Israel's root experience, how a mixed multitude held together initially by a desire for freedom escaped slavery. But now, as you're going to find out, it's a constant refrain that freedom is costly. And as soon as they are free, they begin to whine. That was one of your homework exercises. You didn't all catch the fine data of the question, which was to have you read a little longer, that in chapter 14, when Pharaoh is and his army is catching up with them, the people bitch and complain, let's go, it was so much better in Egypt. And then when Yahweh and Moses worked together to create the pathway, they're all rejoicing. And then the very next story is they're out of water. And again, they're back to bitching. Let's go back. And the question was, what in modern life does that sound like? And if you didn't catch that the victory song was wrapped around with complaining, you kind of missed the point of the question. So I will say that. Make sure after you answer your questions, reread the question, and make sure you answered the question. Many times people think they know what the question is, and they start writing. And then I read it and go, well, but you didn't answer the question. So when you're done doing your homework, go back and reread the question and see if you really did. Or even read the question twice before you start answering it. Because it's easy to get off in the weeds. Because you think you know where we're going, and maybe you don't always. But in any case, no sooner are the people free than there's new troubles. I think I may have used this line last time, maybe not. It is easier to take the slave out of Egypt than to take Egypt out of the slave. In the sense of, even though we complain about being captive to things, captivity is in some ways comfortable to us. At least it's the familiar slavery that we're used to. The slavery of our routines, our schedules, our habits. Sure, we're slaves. We complain all the time about being so busy and running around, but in some ways it's a pleasant captivity to us. So maybe we'll see ourselves in this story too. In any case, now that the Israelites are out of Egypt, they will be formed into God's people. The spiritual, that phrase, let my people go, tells only half the story, because there was a refrain repeated about 8 times in the passages we had last month when Moses says to Pharaoh, let my people go so that they may serve me. So today's class is going to emphasize what that means. So we may serve Yahweh. That's kind of the secondary thread here. Scholars have great difficulty making sense of the place names on the journey. Few of them can be identified with any certainty, including itself the location of Sinai. someone was questioning, the map didn't seem to be very helpful. Well, it's because nobody knows where these places are. Even Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, if you ever take a tour of the Middle East, they'll show you Mount Sinai, and there's wonderful things to be seen there. But Mount Sinai wasn't, the mountain that we call Sinai wasn't identified as such until Christian times. Okay? There's a monastery there now, beautiful and fascinating place. But it was built by Justinian, the 500s. So there might have been a memory before that, but it's really, that's 2 millennia. That's a lot to ask for. That's why we don't have those kinds of sources. Beyond its historical roots, the period of Israel in the wilderness evokes a powerful response as an ambivalent symbol. Negatively, the wilderness means leaving behind settled existence. In Deuteronomy, Moses will talk about the terrible wilderness with its fiery serpents and thirsty ground. That the wilderness bespeaks an abode of demons and spirits. That's the negative side of the wilderness. But positively, it was a time of innocence and intimacy with God. A period that will later be viewed by the prophets as a kind of utopia. Those of you who are married, as a kind of honeymoon. We didn't have much. We had all used furniture. We were living above on the second floor in a little shack of a rental place, but we had each other. That's what you see all the time. I hear those stories all the time from people. But in a way, though, that's how Israel. So Israel looks at this wilderness sojourn in both ways like that. The wilderness sojourn tells the story of the crisis of faith that occurs between bondage and security and well-being. Okay? And a theme that will get greater play as we get through Exodus, Leviticus, and especially the book of Numbers. Elijah, the prophet, who we'll meet later, will journey back. He journeys back to Sinai to find courage to continue in his work. That's told in 1 Kings. There are people that we'll meet in the book of the prophet Jeremiah called Rechabites, who lived in the desert, who thought that was Israel at its best. And so they're kind of like the Amish version of Judaism. They lived in the wilderness because they saw that wilderness time as the time. Or if you're familiar with Qumran, the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they too had an understanding that Israel was never more itself than when it was in the desert, when it was dependent on God. There is more emphasis on theological issues than geographical or historical ones today, because the purpose of the Exodus was not simply freedom or even to provide entrance to the promised land, but that Israel might be formed in relationship with God, with Yahweh. So my parents, when we were children, they used the phrase attitude adjustment hour, and you all know what they meant. That was their happy hour on Sundays. The attitude. So in a sense, the wilderness is a period of attitude adjustment to make this mob into God's people. So our 3 units today are wonderfully structured because they correspond to 3 themes. First, the wilderness is a place of testing. That's the first unit. That's chapters 15 through 18. Then the next lesson, chapters 19 through 24, will focus on the wilderness and Mount Sinai as a place of the covenant, of the marriage bond, here's the word for the day, the first word for today, berith. Berith. That's Hebrew for covenant. Berith. So, and you should get familiar with a little bit of Hebrew now and again. So, berith, B-E-R-I-T-H. Yeah, like it kind of sounds. Thank God for small favors. So, I should put another word down. Another Hebrew word. The Hebrew word for the first session is lun, L-U, long U-N. That means murmur or complain. So that's the word for the first session. Berith is the word for the second session. And then our third unit today, chapters 25 through 31 and 35 through 40, which I am sure you found to be an exciting read, but it has a profound theological meaning. The wilderness as a place of presence. That Yahweh, see, the people came to Sinai, to God's mountain, but in the end, the people leave the mountain with a little miniature Mount Sinai, so that wherever they go, they can revisit that experience. God promised to meet them on Sinai, and now God will meet them wherever they are in the act of worship. Okay? A mobile ark that will lead them on their way, and a tent of meeting as a place of revelation, and a sacrificial system by which they can communicate with God. So, testing, covenant making, place of presence. Those are the themes for today. Questions right now? There is a striking candidness in the Old Testament in the story of the Hebrews' origin as a group of slaves and the repeated stories of their wavering faith in the wilderness. Where else has a people had the courage to be frank about the mess that they were at the start? You know, we like to think of our ancestors as having been, you know, on the Mayflower they came over, or they were important people. But in the Bible, what you have is we were slaves and we were obstreperous, difficult people. Next time, we're going to, you know, at the end of today, you will have read all and studied all of Exodus, but for 3 chapters. And those 3 chapters are really, really essential, because that's when Israel shows its infidelity to God. No sooner have they, no, they're still, you know, they still have pieces of the wedding cake that they're eating, and in the light of that, they give up and say to Aaron, you know, make us a God that we can worship. And then becomes the whole golden calf episode, which it's kind of unfortunate that we're waiting until next month, but it's all part of the great story. Because yes, God tests his people. Yes, they have a marriage bond. Yes, they have a place of presence. But then that marriage bond immediately gets tested, and in a terrible way. And yet God stands firm, with a little help from Moses, as you're going to find out. Okay? So, chapter 15, verse 22. So, Miriam has just sung, again, the refrain of the song at the sea. Look, verse 21. Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." And then Moses leads them away from the Red Sea into the wilderness. Verse 23. They were 3 days on their trek, okay? And they were running short of what was in their canteen. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. That's why it was named Marah. Often, biblical sites have names that have etymological meaning. Marah means bitter, so because the waters there were brackish. And the people murmured. There's the first time it appears. The word murmur appears about 9 times in these chapters. It's never found anyplace else in the Old Testament. Okay? The idea of grumbling complaint. The people murmured against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried to Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a tree, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. So, the people's complaint, mediated through Moses, God responds. Immediately after that, chapter 16. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. Okay, biblical scholars, how many days have they been out from Egypt now? You know enough to figure this out. 75? That's a good guess, but totally wrong. They left. When did they leave Egypt? What had happened? What have they done the night before? Passover. And when is Passover in the lunar calendar? The 15th day of the month, which is full moon. And now we are the 15th day of the 2nd month. Now, maybe that 2nd month, that's what tripped you up, Steve. You count both months. You count the month you were in and the month you're in now. So it's the 15th day of the 2nd month since that left. So it's been 1 month. It's been exactly a month. You would think they see the full moon and they think back, remember the last full moon? That's when God did a mighty thing for us. But instead what you get is complaints. The whole congregation of the people of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness and said, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." You know how it is. Things always look really golden in the rearview mirror. It was, my parents who had a very, your parents had too during the Depression, World War II, and they're getting started as a couple, but they had just golden memories of that. I don't get it. But so similarly here, the people look back because they're hungry today and their stomachs are aching. They're remembering Egypt in a different way than it really was. Remember, they cried out to God and they were oppressed, but now it's looking good because their stomachs were filled. Okay? Present anxiety always distorts the memory of even the recent past. Yesterday could be just a wonderful day, and if today something's going wrong, you got a headache, or everything is awful. We have a very poor ability to hold on. So again, there is this complaint. It says, verse 4, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may prove them." Now this is, I have the RSV, the Revised Standard Version. Prove, test is maybe a better word, whether they will walk in my law or not. Now God hasn't given them any laws yet, but the point is, will they obey my word or not? So here's the law of the manna. It will fall every day except on the Sabbath day. So go out early and collect it, but not on the Sabbath, because it will not fall on the Sabbath. Verse 6. "At evening you shall know that it was," this is Moses telling the people, "At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard." He has heard is, again, that will be a phrase that is repeatedly noted. God hears their complaints. "God has heard your murmurings against the Lord. For what are we that you murmur against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your murmurings, which you murmur against him, what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord." So that word murmur appears a lot, you see right there. Okay, it is the code word for this section. Then in verse 9, and again in verse 12, Moses repeats the statements that God has heard you and your complaints. Verse 13, in the evening, quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning dew lay round about the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as hoarfrost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? In Hebrew, that's man-hu. Man-hu, literally, man-hu. And that's how it gets its name. Manna, we say it in Wisconsin, manna, okay? But it comes from the Hebrew man-hu. What is this? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. Your Bible's footnotes and any commentary on Exodus will tell you that even to this day, there are certain things that may be a natural phenomenon that is reflected here. The Bedouin who live out in the wilderness, there are the trees that they have are tamarisks, and the tamarisk sap, when it like maple syrup sap, the sap of the tamarisk is sweet, and the story is told that there are insects that attack the plant, and they gobble up the sap, and they poop it out, and when it hardens, it flakes, and that's what they eat. That's the origins of the memory of manna. Bug poop. That's not where we got our manna today. We got our manna. Our manna is really not bug poop. I can assure you of that. Again, that's an attempt by modern people to say, well, is there something naturally that was amazing to the Hebrew Israelite slaves, never been in the wilderness, that they saw as a gift from God? Again, in the 18th, 19th centuries, the era of biblical interpretation was touched by the Enlightenment, which had a hard time with God really intervening. And so they looked for the origins of these miraculous things in natural phenomena that happened at a miraculous time when they needed it, but weren't really God's interventions. That's where that kind of train of thought comes from. Verse 20. No sooner then do they start collecting the manna than some don't follow what God has said. They did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning. Because you have to consume it every night. If it stays overnight, you can't store it up. You can't put it in your fridge. You can't freeze it. It's got to be eaten that day. And if you don't do that, what happens is it becomes foul. And Moses is angry because already the people are showing their inability to obey. So in a theological sense, what is God doing here? This is not in their control. You know, that scares us. Lacking control is really frightening. We want to have money in our checking account. We want to have refrigerators full, closets full. We want to be ready for every challenge. But God is testing them to trust in His daily provision. That's how that concept slips into the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. Actually, in the Greek New Testament, the word that is translated as daily, we don't know what it really means, because it's not found anywhere else in any Greek writing. I mean, I don't mean just church writing. You know, when you build a dictionary, you build a dictionary based on the usage of a word. You see how it's used in context, and that's how you find a meaning. But the word in the New Testament, in the Lord's Prayer, epious, we don't know quite what it means. So daily has been an understanding going back to Jerome and the Vulgate. But it's a reference back, I would argue, to this. Give us this day our daily bread. God is teaching about a relationship of trust. And your trust partner can't nail down tomorrow, but he will nail down today and take care of our needs today. The heaven that rained hail down upon the Egyptians that destroyed the foodstuffs of Egypt now rains bread on the slaves. Instead of locusts that came up and devoured the land, now quail come up and cover the ground, exhausted, and are easy pickings. So you see there's a little echo of God's force for threat in the earlier chapters, now a more positive example. Chapter 17. Oh, 33 in the chapter 30, verse 33 of the previous chapter. So Moses is told by God to collect. Well, actually, Moses tells Aaron to collect. Take a jar, put an omer of manna in it, and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. So what he's referring to is it's only later in the second lesson today that, or actually the third lesson today, where the equipment of the tabernacle are built. But Moses tells Aaron to collect a jar of manna that will be placed in the ark. And so here's, even before God announces there's going to be an ark, Moses is kind of, sees it coming. Remember, my argument, why, is it that he's a genius or that God inspires him? Remember, the streams, the various streams of the story have come together. And this stream of the story of the manna assumes that the ark has already been built. Okay? Though the ark will not be described to Moses to build it until after chapter 24. Now, 17. Again, people are thirsty. And they complain because there's no water. Verse 2. Therefore, the people found fault with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you find fault with me? Why do you put Yahweh to the test?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people again murmured, loon, against Moses, and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst?" So Moses cried to Yahweh, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." Verse 6. Behold, God says, "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so. And in the sight of the elders of Israel, he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah. Those are words you should recognize. Psalm 95 uses them, and we sing Psalm 95 a lot at church. I think, was it just last week? Who's our musicians here? Was it just last week? Yeah, just last week. So so let's look at those words. Massah has the root of proof. It means test, Massah, and Meribah. In the middle of Meribah is R-I-B, rib. In Hebrew, words, a whole variety of words are built around roots. And the root is usually found in the center of the word. And then they add a prefix and they add a suffix, so it can mean different things. But rib has the meaning of conflict. Okay? This is going to reappear several times in our study. Hebrew words with the center part being R-I-B mean contest or conflict. Let me look at Psalm 95 just. Don't need to look it up. Just it's frequently prayed as in the liturgy and the liturgy of the hours. This is the psalmist talking to his generation, centuries later. "Oh, that today you would hear God's voice. Harden not your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers tested me and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work." So now, you've sung that for years. And you just like, it could have been anything. And you would just blah, 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 blah. Now you know what it means. You can go, wow, guys, let me tell you about, that's what that, your family's going to just like be so bored that you bring trivia, biblical trivia, back to enlighten their days. They're going to go tired of it. You're going to feel how Moses felt, or the prophets. All right. Chapter 17, verse 8. Here is the next trial. This is a people called the Amalekites, right? The Amalekites are going to be a thorn in the side of the Hebrews throughout the Old Testament. Even when the text says that they're utterly destroyed by David, they're still alive. They are kind of like the Energizer Bunny of evil. And they keep coming back. They keep coming back. So, Klingons, or the board. So, this is a famous scene. This is used on Sunday service, Sunday lectionary. Moses goes up and prays while down in the plain, his sidekick, Joshua, does the battle fighting. Look at verse 12. When Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him to sit on, and Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and one on the other, so his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua mowed down Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. So you have here the statement that it's not just prayer and it's not just action. It's a careful balance of the two that leads to completion of the task. Look at the last verse of chapter 17. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So it's already predicted that this wilderness tribe is going to keep reappearing as a negative example in the lives of God's people. Okay? Chapter 18 is an example of what I think I called last time a literary scene. This is an example of that kind of evidence in the texts that have led scholars to propose that the story of the text of the Torah is a series of different stories, maybe told orally at one point, that come together to become the whole story as we have it. Because we have met this man before. We have met Jethro, the priest of Midian, who was Moses' father-in-law. Sometimes his name changes. That is, the father-in-law of Moses appears with a different name. What's kind of amazing about this is he is not an Hebrew, not an Israelite. He's a desert-dwelling person, and yet he worships Yahweh. Verse 6. When one told Moses, "Behold, your father-in-law Jethro is coming to you with your wife and your 2 sons with you," Moses went out to meet his father-in-law. Now, notice the text goes out of its way to say that Jethro was bringing his wife and sons, as if they weren't with the people when they came out of Egypt. But if you go back, they really were. Earlier, they were there. So this is an example of, there's a story of Jethro bringing Moses' family to him after they escaped from Egypt, while another stream has Moses' wife and family with him through it all. Those are the kinds of doublets that bother some people, but it's, again, if you think about the story as a series of stories that have been retold and folded together over time. Okay? Jethro has a wonderful idea that that will be revealed later. He tells Moses, "You're working too hard, you need helpers." But again, the key point here is that Jethro, this father-in-law, praises the God of Israel. Look at verse 10. Jethro said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hands of the Egyptians, out of the hand of Pharaoh. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because he delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians when they dealt arrogantly with them. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, offered a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. Now, we haven't heard about sacrifices and offerings yet. That will come at Sinai. So here's again, this Jethro story is kind of like a rogue little story that seems to assume that things are already done that haven't been done in the narrative, for what it's worth, just so you understand how that text can work. So, frankly, that's the last kind of big event of this unit, because chapter 19 is part of the next lesson, right? Am I right about that? Okay, so it's really a small, tight little collection, mainly of stories where the newly freed Israelites are put at risk, and how they complain, and how they cry out to God through Moses, and how God responds, giving them water twice, feeding them with manna and quail, defeating their enemies, the Amalekites. Now, you're going to see next time when we read the book of Numbers that these kinds of tests will continue. In fact, that's the other place where the word murmur appears, in the book of Numbers. And what's in between this section and that section is the time, the 11 months when Israel was at Sinai, and they had made this covenant with God, this marriage, if you will, was finalized. So before Sinai, when the people grumble, Moses gets angry, he goes to God, God responds without punishing the people. After Sinai, when the people grumble, God gets angry, and there's always a consequence. Now that might bother you, because we don't like consequences. But the point is, because the Hebrews have pledged their affection for Yahweh, we will do everything you say. From there on out, there will be consequences. Here, none. God gives them what they need. Moses is the voice of anger. Post-Sinai, watch for that difference. Because once you've made the pledge, there are expectations. Okay? Questions? Yes?
What did that loon mean?
Loon means murmur. It's what you all do. You murmur all the time behind my back. What a difficult teacher I am. Things I ask of you. Yes?
What did you say Masa meant?
Masa means test or trial. To try, to test. And Meribah means what?
Conflict.
Conflict. Yes. Yes, Steve.
Chapter 16 at the beginning talked about the wilderness of sin.
Yes.
That always struck me. Is that similar to our word?
No. No more than Wisconsin. Okay? It doesn't mean, it's a name, it's just a place name. It's not the word, English word for sin.
Not a root that.
No, not the same root. No. There is no, the Greek, the Hebrew and the Greek word for sin is not sin. Okay, so, okay. Other questions? Good question. Yes?
You talked about the
Amalekites.
yeah. Is this kind of a prophecy of what will happen greatly in the future? There's many situations throughout history where Jews are punished in different ways, like, for instance, Hitler and what he did, and some other examples that I can think of.
Well, now, again, I would challenge the word punish, because your assumption is that God foists the Amalekites on them as a punishment. That's not a punishment. They're just there. So God, in fact, responds to them. Later on, now, you're anticipating what will happen later. After the marriage bond at Sinai, when Israel is unfaithful, there are consequences. But so this is not that at all. Because again, yes, God has brought them out of Egypt, but they made no pledge, no promise. It's been surely God's grace. They're like little children. I mean, they're adults, but they're like children whom God has set free. And there's no, at this point, we get to Sinai, next lesson, God will say, do you want us to hang with me or don't you? I brought you this